All right. Well, thanks again for inviting us, Dan. And there are some folks on this call who we have talked to over the years. So really excited to hear your thoughts and feedback. So getting started, ASTM, in case you're not familiar, there are over 12,000 ASTM standards, and many of them are used for things like steel and plastics and petroleum. The ASTM process is an open and transparent process that involves direct and equal participation by both users, the people that use the standards. In our case, that's our commercial real estate occupants and owners, and the producers, the providers, those who perform ASTM type work. So you may have heard of ASTM. There are lots of standards out there used for many different things, construction, materials, but there are actually 6 different types of ASTM standards. And the one we're talking about today is a guide, which is really designed to raise awareness on a specific topic. And as Willy said earlier, this is a framework for how to proceed with a process. It is not the same as a specification or a test method, for example. So some of these standards that are very common in the world that I come from, I hope that I can be a little bit of an emissary to you all from the commercial real estate finance. So within commercial real estate finance, there are a set of ASTM standards that are very commonly used. The phase 1 environmental site assessment is something that is ubiquitous to commercial real estate finance because it helps to define if there is an environmental impairment at the property level, something like underground storage tanks or a historic dry cleaner, plating facility, is something that the lending community wants to know about when they're making a loan. And I think the estimate is around 250,000 phase 1 ESAs are conducted annually. And the fact that those environmental site assessments are performed identifies environmental impairments that the environmental regulatory community really could never track down and have resolved. But because the finance cares about making sure there's not an environmental impairment, those things are addressed in the context of your standard getting a commercial real estate loan, refinancing a property. And similarly, property condition assessments are very common for commercial. I want to know if I'm going to spend $3 million on this commercial building, is there a roof issue that's going to impair the value, something that needs to be replaced in the near term that needs to be addressed, right? And of course, there's the seismic risk piece that many of you know way more about. Standards in the world that I come from in commercial real estate are very important for people making decisions. And so what we found over the last few years, and certainly this you're working on as well, is that those who own and finance commercial real estate are increasingly concerned and wanting to understand what is the climate risk, that there can be some regulatory pressure, especially if you're receiving your capital from Europe. You're being asked a lot of questions about how you're looking at climate-related risk. But really, when you think about commercial real estate as an industry, it's all about to earn income, to create value, to see an opportunity that others aren't seeing, and therefore create more value as an entity. So what we're seeing really is those sophisticated commercial real estate owners, investors, developers, they're trying to use climate risk information as a differentiator to get rid of assets, right? And of course, now the commercial insurance markets, the property insurance markets are very challenging. I was excited to see 3 insurance because that really is driving a lot of conversation. And it's not just the borrowers who need to get that insurance coverage. It is also the lenders who have to demonstrate. And in the case of commercial real estate loans that are securitized and formed into bonds, which the investors invest in, the rating agencies also require a certain amount of insurance. And for some single asset state finance council meeting this week, heard about a property over $1 billion in value. The rating agency required $800 million in coverage, and the market was only willing to provide $400 million in coverage. And so the deal stalled, and they had to get creative about how to manage that. On owners, lenders, investors to understand climate risk, there is a lot of pressure. And at the same time, there is a lot of variation in what the providers are providing. And I'm sure you all have heard climate risk assessments. I think using a lot of the data that you create and then laying their own information and risk ratings on top of that. It really is happening across the board that people are getting these reports for their portfolios or on their incoming projects that they're looking at doing. And whether it's a climate risk modeling company or a consulting firm, an engineering firm, there's so much variation in how that information is being used. And I think there's also perhaps a lack of clarity about how much uncertainty should be acknowledged within those reports. So ASTM does have an ability, especially in the case of a guide, which is what we put together, to provide a common language and help provide transparency and consistency to the market with the guide that we put together. So our goal when we formed our task group was to develop an umbrella guide that would outline multi-hazard evaluations for resilience, to really create a foundation from which additional practices, perhaps hazard-specific practices, could be created. You know, there's so much great information and methodologies that exist for some of the hazards, but not for all. So there's a big opportunity there to continue our work. And we really wanted to make sure we were aligning with existing standards and frameworks and not causing conflicts with them. The other, I think, one of the biggest challenges we faced is that when you talk about resilience, it's a systems kind of concept, but the people that wanted this standard are looking for information they can use on the property level. What are the things they control that they can actually have an impact on at the building level, while also acknowledging the intersection with broader resilience, community resilience. The way this intersects too with sustainability reporting that's happening at these commercial real estate entities. It intersects with underwriting and risk management and insurance, as I mentioned, and it intersects with these other existing due diligence processes. So we, with respect to community resilience, we did do our best to say that the guide is focused on physical risk at the property level and the resilience measures that could be employed there at the property level. But we strongly suggest that in the event where it's needed, the provider should recommend a full community resilience study. And, you know, Terry, feel free to jump in at any point if you want to share kind of how ASTM community resilience standard is structured. But we were really careful to say community resilience should be looked at more broadly in a lot of cases. So what is the process? It is a 3-stage process. You know, we looked at a lot of existing frameworks when we put this together. So it's definitely not rocket science. It's really combining many different approaches. And as we said at the beginning, it's multi-hazard. And stage 1 is to really screen for those hazards. And I understand, you know, you all create a lot of information that the public may be using. I think in the world we're coming from, most of the time this is from a commercial provider. Somebody's buying a Moody's report or a Munich Re report, First Street Foundation. They're buying that data in a commercial real estate context, and then they're giving it to a provider, consultant, engineer, who is then looking at any other sources of information. And Willy will talk more about a really important section of the guide, which is where we got these commercial providers to kind of come together and agree on disclosures. So Willy will talk more about that. Stage 2 is actually visiting the property. We thought it was really important that these screenings not just be taken as a desktop, but that really an engineer or an architect should visit the property and look at the building attributes using that information. Also looking at preparedness, how is the operation at the facility ready for whatever hazard might come their way, and many different other factors beyond just what you see in a desktop model. And then, if necessary, identify the resilience measures that might be needed. And I think, Willy, at this point, I was going to hand it over to you.
I think that one of the main things about this PRA, as we call it, is that it's a framework, right? It isn't a procedure that lays out step by step how to do something. It's not a cookbook. And we made a conscious effort not to make it a cookbook and a procedure because there's a lot of R&D going on right now. There's a lot of work being done in the modeling community, and these are not just climate models, mostly they're integrated models, and people bringing in all sorts of other sources of information, which of course are all at different resolutions. They're they have different skill, and you really get to be sort of a witch's brew of information that needs to be, kind of uh, looked through and figured out, and that's going on now. I think that the firms that are providing these types of assessments, and I'm saying the stage one part where they're doing the climate risk assessments, there's some of them are really well funded, and they're pulling ahead, and the ones that are not well funded are struggling to keep up, right? And the sophistication levels will grow. I think there's going to be a consolidation in the market over time, and instead of having 40, 50 companies doing this, there may be 10 or 15. But I do think the sophistication levels are getting better, and it'll take some time, but it's kind of a natural process. So that was really played into our decision to make this a guide as opposed to a prescriptive standard. So what's called a procedure under ASTM's terminology. So one of the things we did was, and I took this from the resilience toolkit that I worked on many years ago with David Herring, was a user engagement section in here which said, hey, you can't just press a button. You really need to be talking to the people that own the building and the people who have asked you to do this assessment to find out, like, what's their use, what's their future look like, what are their what are their risk tolerances, and really have that discussion so that it becomes a little more interactive. And we also, as Holly said, requiring transparency. And I think it's critical when you start doing integrated models and you have a lot of source of uncertainty. There's areas where you've got great skill and areas where you don't have great skill, that those be discussed and those be disclosed. And I still think there are providers, especially on the CAT model side, that aren't providing that kind of transparency. Some are, some aren't. And the ones that are doing more deterministic models are tend to be more open with that. And I think that'll evolve. It'll evolve over time. But the reason we need that is that there are owners and investors and lenders that are running these types of assessments, and they're having 3 or 4 providers run the same building. And the rating systems are such that even though the integrated models are saying, yeah, here's the risk, they're rating them differently. One company will say, hey, it's a medium risk. Another company will say, hey, it's a high risk. And they need to disclose how that rating is being done so that when you're running 2 or 3 different models on the same asset, which happens, believe me, you're able to compare, apples and apples as opposed to apples and oranges. And I think that's an area where over the next, say, 3 years, there's going to be a ton of advancement and a ton of awareness in the real estate community that needs to happen, because it does happen. You have an owner that runs it, you have an investor that runs it, you have a lender that runs it. All of a sudden, you got 3 different reports from 3 different providers, and it's happening, and it's happening a lot. Um, we also put in provisions to say, hey, you can run screening of portfolios and then really drill down to those individual assets that are super high risk, right? And I saw that a lot when I was at Panattoni running CAT models and seeing, hey, I got a portfolio of 150 assets, and guess what? 8 of them are providing 80% of the risk. And this is particularly apparent when you're running the seismic CAT models, say AIR or RMS, and your average annual losses are primarily driven by 6 to 8 assets. And so the same thing is, we're seeing the same thing on the climate side. And really one of the reasons that we wanted to establish that stage 2, which go out, boots in the ground, and look at it and look at the vulnerabilities, is because for those assets that are high risk and are driving the risk, that's what needs to happen. And for a long time it wasn't. We also put in recommendations that compounding and cascading effects be considered. And when we put together the slide deck, I put these slides in of the Boulder County fires here, but we could be putting the same slides, the same pictures in from California right now, which is obviously, drought, high winds, compounding and causing major catastrophes. Next slide, please. So what is it not? It's not a prescriptive procedure. It's not a certification of resilience. It's not like you do this and we say, okay, you're good, you're resilient. It's not like that at all. It's not an audit of code compliance. That's a whole different thing. It's not a greenhouse gas or carbon footprint assessment. It's not looking at taking a deep dive at transitional risk. It's not a financial disclosure, and it's not a PCA, so not a property condition assessment or estimate of repair. But Holly, if you can say, since you're head of a firm that does PCAs, if you can talk a little bit about what's happening in the PCA world and how there's this connection between what PCAs are looking at and the scope.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. As I said, many of the folks who invest and finance commercial real estate traditionally have gotten a phase 1 environmental site assessment, a property condition assessment, and a seismic risk assessment. Now they're adding this climate risk piece, a property resilience assessment. And in some cases, because if let's say the PCA is saying the building needs a new roof and the PRA is identifying an elevated hazard for wind, you really want to compare that information, make sure you're making a decision with all the information in hand. So we really in this industry are still trying to figure out, will the PCA, or will people continue to have separate reporting from a PCA and a climate risk perspective? But right now it really is a mix of different approaches out there. We did want to share with you all some of the folks that were involved in developing the standard. And so we have a couple different slides here showing the owners and investors who were involved and their different perspectives. Yeah, so the people you see here, they were involved in developing this framework. Their motivations for assisting are listed here on the right. They're looking, as we've been saying, at the climate risk within their portfolio and on an asset by asset basis. They're concerned about insurance availability, and of course, they're concerned about their exit strategies. We also had some of the folks listed here, the lending institutions. Another kind of topic here is it's very common, well, it's pretty much standard to get an appraisal on a commercial real estate loan. And so another question that people are asking is, can we pull climate risk into the appraisal, or do we even want to? But certainly banks are thinking about what will be the impact of the climate risk on their the values of the properties within their loan portfolio. And I think the way that's showing up most dramatically right now is in the insurance space, because insurance is priced annually, as you know, and net operating income does affect the appraised value. So insurance is having a direct impact on property values.
Anybody have a question? Just raise your hand. Norma Jean. Oh, she's telling me she can hear me, so I appreciate that. All right, well, while you're thinking about your questions, I'm getting feedback, so that's why I'm stop and start. I want to go back to something you mentioned. Obviously, we're primarily interested in, hang on a minute. I'm going to try a different approach. All right. What I was going to say is we're primarily interested in, how to develop, codes and standards, ASCE engineering standards, which, are incorporated by reference into building codes all across the country, as I think most folks on the call are aware. And we're trying to explore this interaction with the kinds of research you're doing here, the kinds of standards that ASTM is developing that you and Holly just talked about, Willie. You mentioned something about how there's not a code compliance piece of this. Can you just expand on that a little bit? Because one of the things we're trying to do is encourage the uptake of hazard resilient building codes. And we've talked about it many times that unless there's a financial signal, a financial incentive, we're just going to we expect to continue to encounter headwinds in that area, especially as, there's kind of a change in mindset around ESG, and there's a lot of change taking place, maybe a little bit of a softening on enthusiasm for things. I know even in my home state of Maine, in the last election, building codes were on the agenda. There was pushback that building codes actually contribute to homelessness. So I'm trying to explore this space a little bit. So if you could talk about building codes in this context, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, let me say that I didn't mean to suggest that building codes are not considered at all. I think the engineers and architects that go out and look at these properties and look for vulnerabilities are very much aware of the building codes, and they use the ASC tool. And the only thing I'm saying is that it was never our intent to have the PRA be an assessment of building code compliance. And it just, we wanted to keep this very narrowly focused. I mean, even as narrowly focused as it is, it was a huge endeavor. I mean, it took us 3.5 years to get this done. And it's a fairly large, for ASTM kind of standards. I mean, it's very long compared to what ASTM standards usually are. So we wanted to keep it narrow, but I think that, you know, the point you're making, which is that codes are super important, and building standards like ASC Tout like 7 are extremely important. And I do think they're used. I think they're looked at. I think they're used. And in talking to engineering firms that are doing this, they go, absolutely. Yeah, that's and even some of the providers that are doing the stage 1 assessments are using that information, and certainly use ASCE 7 as part of their threshold setting to decide what to look at, what not to look at, what to be concerned about, and what is a low, medium risk.
All right, thanks, Willie. Bilal, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Willie and Holly, for the presentation. My name is Bilal Ayub. I'm an engineering professor at Maryland, and I co-chair the task force. And I'd like to thank you for coming here and presenting to us. I have a question. What does customers, what do they look for in terms of the metrics or the way the risk is presented to them? Is it in the form of loss exceedance curves? Is it by hazard? What is a typical list? It might vary from one client to another, but I'm just curious how the results are presented
by hazard.
In the most
It's done by hazard, for sure. And these rating systems vary a lot, you know. The rating systems vary quite a bit. Sometimes there are algorithms that are used. Sometimes it's a simple comparison to a threshold. It might be, you know, a flood threshold. It could be a wind threshold. It varies quite a bit. And that's one of the things we're really grappling with, is that people just want to know. I mean, remember, the people that get these assessments done, a lot of times are not technical. They're not engineers. They're not architects. They're not scientists. They're financial people. And they just want to know, is it low, medium, or high? Be concerned, you know. And one of the things that's happening is that a lot of these firms, whether it be owners, REITs, investors, lenders, are staffing up with people that are technical and can make heads or tails of it, and can advise the companies, and also work with the providers, so that there's clarity in what's being provided in terms of the rating systems that are used. But it's not, you know, you can say, okay, you've got a property that's got potential exposure to 3 different types of hazards, and one of them is like low, another one's medium, another one's high. It's hard to say, okay, that's a medium exposure on that property, because you do have a high, and you kind of need to look at it by hazard, and evaluate it that way. And what's happening is that even hazard to hazard, the rating systems that are used are not consistent. And we had a long discussion with providers, owners, and investors that I put together to talk about whether we should say, okay, this is the rating systems you should use. And generally, where we came out was that people aren't far enough along. The firms aren't far enough along to agree. And that's what we need, is consensus, right? And so we'll get there, but it's going to take a little time.
I would say that the guide does talk about the difference between qualitative and quantitative findings in the stage 2 piece. And we included a preference for quantitative, but allow for qualitative to the extent that a guide allows for anything. It's really just a stronger suggestion. And as Willie said, it really does vary by hazard. We also have some language in the guide about, you know, we recommend that the accepted methodologies for quantifying damage by hazard, you know, utilize generally accepted industry standards where they exist, but we acknowledge that they don't exist for all the hazards that could be encountered in a PRA. So as Willie said, it really is early stages, and what clients are asking for really based depending on if they're a lender or an investor or a builder. They have different perspectives, and they want a different depth of assessment.
Yeah, also I'm wondering about the time scale. Is the assessment done for, what's the planning horizon? Is it for the next year or a decade?
So that's a good question, and that's also covered in that user piece that happens before we even begin the assessment, is what is the time horizon? What's the risk appetite? What are the resilience objectives? You know, what kind of property are we talking about? So that horizon is defined at the beginning of the assessment.
Yeah, some providers are doing a here and now. Okay, so those of you that are sophisticated in the climate world know that means it's the next 5 or 10 years, okay, of what's happening in the climate world. Some providers are actually providing forecasts of what is this risk now versus what's it going to be in 20 or 30 years. But none of them are. And you can request it, absolutely. Some are good at it, some aren't good at it.
Thank you.
Joe?
Hi, I had a question just about the availability of this guide, because of course we're working on some you know, some papers on like non-stationarity and how to deal with it, and questions of disclosure or depth of assessment, and different levels of disclosure of what you've used for different levels of assessment come up. And it'd be very interesting to see how you handle that in this. We're looking also for good examples to reference when we put this together. This is Sihan's leading this. Sihan Lee is leading this, but we are looking for good examples.
Okay, yeah, we'd love to share it with you. Love to share it with you.
Yeah, it's available. It's available on the ASTM's website. They even required me to help write it. buy it. I buy the thing. Like I wrote it.
I've had to do that for things I've written. Yes.
Yeah, it's crazy. But Joe, I'm here in Denver. Okay, and
Yeah.
I'm happy to either get on the phone with you or get together at whatever stages of things you are and talk through things like that.
That would be great. The other question I had was just about the word modeling. I assume it's like a generic term for like a large variety of risk modeling. It's not climate modeling.
Yeah,
Risk modeling, I think of climate modeling, but obviously risk modeling is, a very amorphous thing, right?
Yeah, most everyone that is doing is taking CMIP, 5 or 6 and incorporating that. And they're not doing the climate modeling themselves, right? And then these are really integrated models. So they're taking that and combining it with other information and other models and trying to do, more of an integrated model approach. And that's, it's a little scary. Some of them don't have access to, big, powerful computers. Some of them don't have, very sophisticated people on staff. Some do, some don't. I think that's where there's a lot of work going on now. And even over the last 2 or 3 years, I've an order of magnitude, I guess, improvement in the types of ancillary information, supporting information that's being incorporated into the integrated models. And
Where would I go to just get a general overview of what these integrated models do or what they look like? Because I can talk to you, obviously, but maybe.
Yeah, I can probably help you with that. A lot of folks are saying, hey, you buy one of our reports and you can see some of the stuff that we do. And I could probably get you, reports from a couple different firms that you can look at that are better on the transparency and disclosure side. So you can look at them and we can look at them together if you want. But I think I can probably connect you with some folks that might be okay talking to you about it.
It's just mainly to understand what data they're using and what the inputs are for what we do. Yeah. So we can talk more about this, but that's the reason I'm interested.
I can help you with that.
Yeah.
I can help you with that too.
You work with Mari, so we're all connected. So great.
Yeah. I do have a list of that in general, and some of it is region dependent. Obviously, in certain regions, sea level rise is more important than wildfires. And there's state resources available and such, but it varies quite a bit, Joe. It does.
All right. All right. I guess I just would like have one more question here, if you don't mind. Where do you see this going? How it's really 2 threads that I can kind of see. One is, do you have a measure of how the standard is taken up? Is it beginning to achieve the goal that you were striving for? And what are you doing to kind of? I know, Holly, you and Willy have been all over the place doing these briefings. What's your sense of where this is going? And I have a reason for this question, but I'll hold off. Go ahead.
Holly, do you want to talk about the dashboard we're setting up?
Yeah, so we are creating a feedback loop. So anyone who generates a PRA or obtains a PRA will be asked to fill out a survey so that we can get a sense of the size of the market and the effectiveness of the guide and creating that transparency. And ASTM standards are revised pretty periodically. So we expect to be working on a new version fairly soon, utilizing the feedback. And if anyone else on this call has taken a look at it or does take a look at it and have any advice, suggestions, please let us know. But Dan, to your question, I think the property insurance crisis, regardless of what happens with sustainability as a driving force, the property insurance crisis is driving investors and lenders to care about resilience. And they are getting this information before doing deals, before making loans. The rating agencies are very concerned with insurability. So I think all of us who care about resilience have an opportunity to provide good information that'll drive decisions. I do think that buildings that are built to a better code are going to fare better in the long term on these resilience reports and therefore in the commercial real estate finance space. But that also has potential negative consequences for communities that have been deprived of capital for other reasons, and then will then be subject to yet another reason why risk managers are not giving capital to that area. So the view of the future from my seat is that this information is being pulled into commercial real estate finance decisions. When money cares about something, behavior changes. And I think over time, we will see more resilient buildings be rewarded by increased property values and more attractive investment.
All right. I thank you. Yeah, the ASCE had a recent summit with the finance industry, and I think it would be interesting to kind of compare the lenders and the other groups that were involved in your ASTM standard versus the group that was at ASCE. But one of the things that comes up, and it even came up in India, that this quote comes up over and over again, that $1 of investment in resilience leads to $11 to $12 of savings, et cetera. But the National Institute for Building Safety, which I think was one of the originators of that number, has a figure in there that shows how that benefit accrues to different sectors. And the builders get almost none of it, and the lenders get almost none of it, at least according to the report. And the benefit is largely recognized by the owners or the leasers. And so, the builders, when we promote these standards within ASCE, there's a constant drumbeat of, well, yeah, more resilient, that might be fine, but it's going to raise cost of property, and so they are very conservative. They're the ones that are part of the affected community. They're part of the process, and they push back. They really want to keep these as minimum standards. And that's my personal opinion, is that's the reason why ASCE standards have been very slow to take up climate for example. That's changing now, but we're probably a decade behind. Do you see an opportunity here to kind of connect some of these dots and maybe work together to try to advance the idea of building resilient building codes and educate this broader community? Because depending on who you talk to, they'll either say, "Oh, we don't see a signal an issue for us," but I think that might be regional or portfolio specific. So I just wanted to see if you had any reaction to that.
Yeah, I do, Dan, because I was in that world for a long time. And a lot of builders, developers are building it, they're developing it and they're selling it. Okay? And the takeout parties tend to be REITs and portfolios that are managed by large investment firms like a LaSalle and others, lots of others, and so the way they see the world, it's all very different. The builders and developers want, like you said, you're very out there, they want the lowest cost for the building so that it's the lowest rent, so they can lure high value tenants and make as much money as they can on the rent. But primarily where they make their money is in the sale. So if you build a building for $100 million and you sell it for 200 million, it's a happy day. But if you got to spend 120 million on the building and you sell it for 200 million, then it's not as a happy day. But owners and REITs and investors, they really are the ones that benefit from that investment that you talked about, the 1 versus 12. It's not the builders and developers, and it is the lenders. So I think one of the things that has to be done is you really need to drill down as to who are you talking to, and separate out the builders and developers versus the owners and the REITs and investors, and separate out the lenders as another group, because they all have different motivations. And yes, I do think that raising awareness will achieve what you're trying to achieve. And I'm already seeing it starting, as I said, in both the stage 1 and stage 2 work, where providers and assessors are looking at building codes, they're looking at standards, and they're using some of your CE work because of the great help it is in establishing thresholds for risk tolerances. And so yes, and yes. But I think we need to be conscious about who we're talking to and what their motivations are, and it's not the same. And I don't want anybody to take that as a negative, because it just is what it is. And
Right.
the drivers are going to be the owners, REITs, and investors. I think the lenders are going to drive for different reasons.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.